Elena Vasquez walked through the massive doors of the Galactic Council chamber. Her small human frame looked tiny next to the enormous alien structures around her. The walls stretched up so high she could barely see the top. Everything was made of black stone that seemed to absorb light. She wore a simple blue diplomatic uniform from Earth. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat style. Elena kept her face calm and professional, just like they taught her in diplomatic training. Inside, her heart was beating fast. This was the most important meeting in human history. The chamber was filled with aliens unlike anything humans had ever imagined. To her left sat the Zephyrians, beings made of living crystal that caught and reflected light in rainbow patterns. They communicated by changing the colors in their bodies. Elena had studied their language for months, learning to read the subtle color shifts that meant different emotions and ideas. Behind them floated the Nebulans, creatures that looked like clouds of glowing gas. They had no solid form, just swirling mist that changed shape as they moved. When they spoke, their voices sounded like wind through metal pipes. Elena needed a special translator device to understand them. The most intimidating aliens were the Carvex. They looked like giant insects with hard black shells and multiple arms. Their eyes were compound like a fly's, made up of thousands of tiny parts. Sharp mandibles clicked when they talked. Elena had read that they were the Empire's main military force. At the center of it all sat Chancellor Luxor Prime. He was the strangest of all, a being made of pure light that constantly shifted and moved. Sometimes he looked almost human-shaped, other times like abstract patterns of energy. When he spoke, his voice came from everywhere at once. "Welcome, representative of the species called humans," Luxor Prime said. His voice was smooth and seemed friendly, but Elena detected something underneath it, a tone that suggested he was talking to a child. Elena walked to the small platform in the center of the chamber. It was clearly designed for much larger beings. She had to look up at almost everyone in the room. This was intentional, she realized. They wanted her to feel small and insignificant. "Thank you for allowing me to speak before this distinguished council," Elena said. Her voice carried clearly through the chamber thanks to the translation system. "I am Ambassador Elena Vasquez, speaking for the United Earth government and all human colonies." Several aliens made sounds that Elena's translator told her were expressions of mild amusement. The Carvex delegates' mandibles clicked in what seemed like laughter. A few Zephyrians shifted to colors that indicated they found something entertaining. "Please, be seated," Luxor Prime said, gesturing to a chair that appeared to be made of the same light energy as himself. "We have much to discuss regarding your species' future." Elena sat down carefully. The chair felt solid despite being made of light. She placed her hands in her lap and waited. She had been trained for this moment for 2 years, ever since the Empire's first ships appeared at the edge of human space. "Your species is young," Luxor Prime began. "You have only recently achieved faster-than-light travel. You have established colonies on a mere handful of worlds. In galactic terms, you are infants taking your first steps into a very large and complex universe." Other aliens nodded or made their species equivalent of agreement. The Zephyrians pulsed with confident blue colors. The Nebulans swirled in patterns that Elena's translator said meant obvious truth. "This galaxy can be dangerous for young species," the Chancellor continued. "There are hostile forces, unknown threats, complex political situations that could destroy an unprepared civilization. Many promising species have been lost because they tried to navigate galactic politics alone." Elena listened without changing her expression. She had expected this approach. The Empire always started with the same speech about protecting younger species. "Fortunately," Luxor Prime said, his form brightening, "the Galactic Empire exists to guide and protect developing civilizations. For 12,000 years we have brought peace, stability, and prosperity to hundreds of species across the galaxy." A holographic display appeared in the center of the chamber. It showed a map of the galaxy with thousands of star systems highlighted in gold. Each one, Elena knew, represented a species that had been integrated into the Empire. 847 species now enjoy the benefits of Imperial protection and guidance, the Chancellor said proudly. They have access to advanced technology, peaceful trade networks, and security from hostile forces. Their people live longer, healthier lives under Imperial care. The Carvex military commander spoke for the first time. His voice was harsh and clicking like breaking wood. "Young species often fear change. But integration has never failed to improve a civilization's condition. Resistance only leads to unnecessary suffering. Elena noticed how the other aliens reacted to this. Even the peaceful-looking Zephyrians shifted to colors that suggested agreement with the military threat. This was clearly a well-practiced routine. The terms we offer humanity are generous, Luxor Prime continued. Full integration into the Empire with protected status for your developing colonies. Access to our technology and trade networks. Guidance in planetary development and population management. Protection from hostile species who might otherwise threaten your worlds. A document appeared on a holographic screen in front of Elena. She read through it quickly, noting the careful language. Everything was phrased to sound beneficial, but she could see what it really meant. Human military forces would be disbanded. Human governments would become local administrators under Imperial oversight. Human resources would be managed by Imperial experts. We understand this is a significant decision for your species, the Chancellor said. We are prepared to be patient while you consult with your leaders on Earth. However, we must point out that other young species have benefited greatly from making this decision quickly. The implicit threat was clear. Species that delayed integration faced problems that were solved when they finally joined the Empire. Elena stood up slowly. This is indeed a momentous decision for humanity. The United Earth government will need time to fully consider your generous offer and consult with all human colonies. Of course, Luxor Prime said, his form pulsing with what seemed like satisfaction. How much time will you require? 3 standard galactic weeks should be sufficient, Elena replied. Excellent. We look forward to welcoming humanity into the Imperial family. The Chancellor's tone suggested he already knew what the answer would be. As Elena prepared to leave, she took one last look around the chamber. Every alien face or energy pattern seemed confident that this meeting had gone exactly as planned. They had seen this scene hundreds of times before. A young species representative came in, listened to the offer, and left to convince their people to accept the inevitable. Elena walked toward the exit, her footsteps echoing in the vast chamber. Behind her, she could hear the quiet sounds of alien conversation. They were probably already discussing the integration timeline for humanity. But Elena was thinking about something else entirely. She was thinking about the 3 Imperial scout ships that had spent 2 weeks in human space before this diplomatic contact. She was thinking about the detailed scans they had run on Earth's defenses. She was thinking about the way they had mapped human military installations and counted human warships. The Empire called it Standard Preliminary Assessment. On Earth, they had a different name for uninvited military surveillance of sovereign territory. Elena stepped through the massive doors and into the corridor beyond. In 3 weeks, she would return to this chamber. But the conversation would be very different from what these aliens expected. 3 weeks had passed since Elena's first meeting with the Galactic Council. Now she stood outside the same massive chamber doors, but everything felt different. The alien guards at the entrance barely looked at her as she passed. They had seen this routine so many times that it had become boring. Elena walked through the doors into the familiar chamber. The same aliens sat in the same positions. Chancellor Luxor Prime glowed with confident light at the center of it all. The Zephyrians displayed calm blue colors. The Nebulans swirled in relaxed patterns. Even the intimidating Karvek seemed more casual than before. Ambassador Vasquez, the Chancellor said warmly, welcome back. I trust your consultations with Earth have gone well. Elena made her way to the small platform in the center of the room. This time the chair of light was already waiting for her. She sat down and arranged her papers on the small table that appeared. Thank you, Chancellor Luxor Prime. The United Earth government has given very careful consideration to the Empire's generous offer. The aliens around the chamber seemed to relax even more. Several Zephyrians shifted to colors that Elena's translator identified as satisfaction. The Nebulans moved in what appeared to be pleased patterns. Excellent, Luxor Prime said. His form brightened noticeably. I am certain your leaders have recognized the benefits that Imperial integration will bring to humanity. Elena nodded slowly. Oh yes, Chancellor. Earth's leaders were very interested in everything the Empire has to offer. Advanced technology, peaceful trade, protection from hostile forces, all very appealing to a young species like ours. The Karvek's military commander's mandibles clicked in what sounded like approval. One of the Zephyrian delegates shifted to a color that meant wise decision. Everything was going exactly as the Empire expected. However, Elena continued, There was one aspect of the Empire's approach that confused us somewhat. The word however seemed to catch some attention. A few aliens shifted position slightly, but there was no real concern yet. Young species often had small concerns that needed to be addressed during integration. Please explain your confusion, Chancellor Luxor Prime said patiently. We are here to address any concerns humanity might have. Elena opened one of her folders and pulled out a data pad. Well, you see, before we could even properly respond to your diplomatic offer, the Empire sent what appeared to be military vessels to our system. The chamber remained quiet, but Elena noticed subtle changes. The nebulan's swirling patterns became slightly more rigid. A few Zephyrians shifted from blue satisfaction to yellow uncertainty. These ships, Elena continued reading from her datapad, conducted detailed scans of our planetary defenses. They mapped our asteroid mining operations in the outer system. They observed and recorded our military installations. They counted our defensive platforms and analyzed our weapon systems. Chancellor Luxor Prime's form flickered slightly. Ambassador, I believe you may be misunderstanding standard Imperial protocol. Those were preliminary assessment vessels, conducting routine surveys as part of the integration preparation process. Ah, Elena said, as if a light had just turned on. That explains the confusion. You see, in human culture, we have very specific ideas about what constitutes appropriate diplomatic behavior. She stood up and walked a few steps away from her chair, making sure her voice would carry to every corner of the chamber. When someone wants to establish diplomatic relations with humanity, they typically send a message first. They request permission to enter our space. They identify themselves clearly and state their intentions. They respect our territorial boundaries. The chamber was getting quieter. Even the normally chattering Zephyrians had stopped their color communications. Elena turned back toward Chancellor Luxor Prime. What they don't do is send unmarked military vessels to conduct surveillance of our defenses without permission. On Earth, we have a very specific name for that kind of activity. Ambassador, the Chancellor said, his voice carrying a slight edge now. I assure you that no hostile intent was involved in our preliminary assessment. This is standard procedure that has been followed for thousands of years with hundreds of species. I'm sure it is, Elena replied calmly. But you have to understand, Chancellor, that humanity wasn't aware of your standard procedures. All we saw were unidentified military vessels conducting detailed surveillance of our defenses. All we observed were foreign ships mapping our military capabilities without our knowledge or consent. The Carvex commander leaned forward slightly, his compound eyes focused on Elena with new interest. What exactly are you suggesting, human? Elena looked directly at the insectoid military leader. I'm not suggesting anything, Commander. I'm simply explaining how humanity interpreted the Empire's actions based on our own cultural understanding. She paused, letting the tension in the room build slightly. You see, when someone enters your home without permission, studies your security systems, maps your defenses, and catalogs your weapons, we don't typically call that a diplomatic overture. The chamber was now completely silent. Even the ambient sounds from the alien technology seemed to have quieted. Elena's voice remained calm and professional, but her words carried clearly to every being in the room. In human culture, when someone conducts uninvited military surveillance of your sovereign territory, we have a very specific term for that activity. Chancellor Luxor Prime's form was no longer glowing as brightly. And what term is that, Ambassador? Elena looked up at the towering light being, her expression serious but not hostile. We call it reconnaissance in preparation for invasion. We call it an act of aggression against a sovereign nation. We call it a violation of our territorial integrity. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Several aliens made sounds of surprise or confusion. The Zephyrians were rapidly shifting through colors that Elena's translator was having trouble keeping up with. More specifically, Elena continued, in human diplomatic and legal terminology, we call it an assault on our sovereignty, an assault on our security, an assault on our right to exist as a free and independent species. She sat back down in her chair and folded her hands in her lap. So you see, Chancellor, before we could even begin to consider the Empire's offer of integration, we had to address this fundamental issue. Because from humanity's perspective, the Empire didn't begin these negotiations with a diplomatic overture. Elena's eyes moved around the chamber, making contact with as many alien representatives as possible. From humanity's perspective, The Empire began these negotiations by committing what we would classify as an act of war against Earth and all human colonies. The silence that followed was absolute. In 12,000 years of galactic expansion, no species had ever characterized the Empire's standard preliminary survey as an act of war. The very concept seemed to break something fundamental in the way these aliens understood the universe. Elena waited patiently for someone to respond, her expression unchanged. But inside she was counting heartbeats, waiting for the moment when the Empire would realize that humanity was not going to follow their script. The silence in the chamber stretched like a taut wire. Elena could feel the weight of hundreds of alien eyes, energy patterns and attention focused on her small human form. The translator system seemed to be working overtime, trying to convert the flood of alien exclamations and reactions into something she could understand. Chancellor Luxor Prime's form flickered and pulsed in patterns Elena had never seen before. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all of its diplomatic smoothness. "Ambassador Vasquez, you cannot be serious. The Empire's preliminary assessment protocols are standard throughout the galaxy. Every species undergoes the same process. It is not an act of war. It is a necessary step in ensuring successful integration." The Carvex military commander rose to his full intimidating height, all 6 of his arms spreading wide. "This is preposterous. The mighty Galactic Empire does not commit acts of war against primitive species. We offer guidance and protection." Around the chamber, other aliens were reacting with various forms of shock, anger, and confusion. The Zephyrians were flashing through colors so rapidly it looked like a lightning storm. The Nebulans had contracted into tight, agitated spirals. Even the normally calm energy beings in the upper galleries were pulsing with disturbed patterns. Elena remained seated, her hands still folded calmly in her lap. She had expected this reaction. Her training had prepared her for the moment when she would drop this particular bombshell into the Empire's comfortable routine. "I understand your confusion, Chancellor," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the alien chatter. "But you must try to see this from humanity's perspective. We are a young species, as you've pointed out. We don't have 12,000 years of galactic history to draw on. All we have is our own experience and our own cultural understanding." She stood up and activated her own holographic display. Images appeared in the air above the chamber. Recordings from Earth's defense network showing the Imperial scout ships moving through human space. "This is what we saw," Elena continued. 3 unidentified vessels of clearly military design entering our solar system without permission or prior contact. They avoided our communication attempts. They used advanced scanning technology to penetrate our planetary defenses. They mapped the locations of our military installations, our population centers, our industrial facilities. The images changed to show detailed scans of the ship's activities. Elena had been authorized to reveal some of Earth's monitoring capabilities, and the data was impressively comprehensive. They cataloged our weapon systems, analyzed our defensive capabilities, and identified strategic targets throughout human space. All of this was done in secret, without our knowledge or consent. Chancellor Luxor Prime's form had stabilized somewhat, but he was clearly struggling with concepts that didn't fit his worldview. "Ambassador, these activities are standard procedure. They are necessary for proper integration planning. Surely your species understands the need for proper preparation." Elena nodded as if she found this perfectly reasonable. "Oh, absolutely, Chancellor. Humanity completely understands the need for proper preparation. In fact, we've been doing quite a bit of preparation ourselves." Something in her tone made the chamber quieter again. The Carvex commander's compound eyes focused on her with sharp attention. "You see," Elena continued, "when an unknown military force conducts reconnaissance of your territory, standard human military doctrine requires certain responses. We had to assume hostile intent until proven otherwise." She touched her control pad and new images appeared. These showed Earth's own activities during the 3 weeks since the first diplomatic meeting. So while you were waiting for our response to your integration offer, humanity was implementing our own standard protocols for dealing with potential military threats. The aliens around the chamber leaned forward or adjusted their positions to get better views of Elena's display. What they saw clearly surprised them. The images showed massive defensive preparations throughout human space. New weapons platforms being deployed, military factories working around the clock, ships being pulled back from exploration missions and retrofitted for combat. We've also been conducting our own intelligence gathering. Elena said casually. We've analyzed the Empire's expansion patterns over the past several centuries. We've studied your military deployments, your resource allocation systems, your standard integration procedures. More images appeared, showing detailed analysis of Imperial fleet movements, supply lines, and strategic vulnerabilities. The data was far more comprehensive than any of the aliens had expected from a primitive species. We've also been in contact with some of your existing subject species, Elena added. It's remarkable what you can learn when you talk to people who have actually experienced Imperial integration firsthand. This statement sent a visible shock through the chamber. Several aliens made sounds of distress or alarm. The idea that humans had been secretly communicating with Imperial subjects was clearly disturbing to them. Chancellor Luxor Prime's voice carried a new edge when he spoke. Ambassador, what exactly are you suggesting? What is the purpose of this? Intelligence gathering. Elena's expression remained calm, but her next words carried the weight of an entire species' resolve. I'm not suggesting anything, Chancellor. I'm telling you directly that humanity has spent the past 3 weeks preparing for war. The chamber erupted into chaos. Aliens were shouting, flashing colors, swirling in agitated patterns and making sounds that Elena's translator couldn't even process. The Carvex commander was clicking his mandibles, so rapidly it sounded like machine gun fire. Elena waited for the noise to die down before continuing. You said earlier that resistance only leads to unnecessary suffering. But you're operating under a fundamental misunderstanding about humanity. You assume we're afraid of suffering. You assume we'll choose submission over conflict. You assume we're like every other species you've encountered. She touched her control pad one final time. The images that appeared now were from human history. Battles, wars, conflicts spanning thousands of years. What you don't understand is that humanity has never been successfully conquered by any force in our history. We've fought wars that lasted generations. We've sacrificed millions to preserve our freedom. We've rebuilt our entire civilization from ashes rather than accept subjugation. Elena's voice grew stronger as she spoke. We've fought each other, our environment, our predators, and every force that ever threatened our independence. And we've never ever submitted to anyone who tried to tell us how to live our lives. She looked directly at Chancellor Luxor Prime. So when you sent military vessels to scout our defenses without permission, you weren't conducting a standard preliminary assessment. You were making the first move in what humanity recognizes as preparation for invasion. The chamber had gone completely silent again. Elena could feel the weight of their attention, but also something else. For the first time, she sensed uncertainty from these powerful beings. The question before us today, Elena said clearly, isn't whether humanity will submit to Imperial integration. The question is what you intend to do about the fact that you have already committed what we consider an act of war against Earth and all human colonies. Elena sat back down and folded her hands again. Around her, the most powerful beings in the galaxy struggled to process the idea that their standard procedures might be seen as acts of aggression. For 12,000 years, no species had ever said no to the Empire. Now, for the first time, they were facing a species that not only said no, but considered the Empire's very approach to be an attack on their sovereignty. The galaxy was about to change, and none of them were prepared for what came next. The Galactic Council Chamber had never experienced anything like this. In 12,000 years of expansion, integration, and diplomatic routine, no species had ever challenged the Empire's fundamental approach to first contact. The very foundations of imperial policy were being questioned by a species that most aliens considered barely civilized. Chancellor, Luxor Prime's form was pulsing with patterns that Elena's cultural briefings had told her indicated extreme agitation. Around the chamber, delegates were arguing in 17 different languages. The Zephyrians were flashing through color combinations that meant everything from outrage to confusion. The Nebulans had formed tight defensive spirals. Even the normally disciplined Carvex were clicking and chittering among themselves. Order! The Chancellor finally boomed, his voice echoing from every surface in the chamber. There will be order in this council. The alien chatter gradually died down, but Elena could still feel the tension crackling through the air like electricity. Every being in the chamber was staring at her with expressions she couldn't read. But the hostility was obvious. Ambassador Vasquez, Chancellor Luxor Prime said, his voice now carrying what sounded like barely controlled anger. You seem to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of galactic civilization. The Empire has brought peace and prosperity to 847 species across this galaxy. Our methods have proven successful for 12 millennia. Elena listened politely, her expression unchanged. She had been trained for this moment, when the Empire would try to reassert its authority through intimidation. Every species that has joined the Empire has benefited immensely, the Chancellor continued. They have access to advanced technology, medical knowledge, educational systems, and trade networks that would have taken them thousands of years to develop independently. Their people live longer, healthier, more prosperous lives under Imperial guidance. The Carvex commander stood up again, his massive form towering over the chamber. Young species often resist change due to ignorance and fear. But integration is inevitable. The benefits always become clear once the process is complete. Elena nodded as if she found this perfectly reasonable. That's a very compelling argument, Commander. I can see why so many species have accepted integration over the years. Several aliens seemed surprised by her reasonable tone. The Zephyrians shifted to colors that indicated cautious optimism. Perhaps the human was finally seeing sense. However, Elena continued, and that word sent another ripple of tension through the chamber. I'm curious about something. In 12,000 years of expansion, how many species have actually chosen to say no to Imperial integration? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Chancellor Luxor Prime's form flickered as he processed the implications. All rational species recognize the benefits of Imperial membership, he said carefully. Elena smiled slightly. That's interesting. Because according to our analysis of Imperial expansion patterns in 12,000 years, exactly 0 species have ever declined integration. That seems statistically unlikely, doesn't it? She activated her holographic display again. New data appeared showing the Empire's expansion over time, with detailed analysis of contact patterns, integration timelines, and resource allocation. We've been studying your expansion methods very carefully, Chancellor. The preliminary reconnaissance, the diplomatic contact, the integration offer, the 3-week consideration period. It's the exact same pattern for every species you've encountered. The display showed overlay maps of dozens of different first contact scenarios. The pattern was identical in every case. What's particularly interesting is what happens to species that take longer than the standard consideration period to respond. They seem to experience various problems: supply shortages, piracy attacks, natural disasters, until they decide that Imperial protection would be very valuable. Elena could see several aliens shifting uncomfortably. Clearly, not everyone in the Empire was aware of how their expansion actually worked, but the most fascinating discovery we made was when we started talking to representatives from some of your current member species. This statement sent another shock through the chamber. The idea that humans had been conducting unauthorized communications with Imperial subjects was clearly very disturbing to the leadership. Elena touched her control pad, and new images appeared. These showed communication logs, testimony recordings, and detailed interviews. It turns out that many of your member species have some very interesting stories about their integration experience. Would you like to hear some examples? Before anyone could respond, Elena continued. The Vorthon remember their consideration period being cut short by a mysterious plague that only Imperial medical technology could cure. The Zalani recall supply ships for their outer colonies being attacked by pirates, who disappeared as soon as they accepted Imperial protection. The Morphic Collective experienced computer viruses that crippled their communication networks until Imperial technicians arrived to help. Each revelation sent visible waves of shock through the assembled delegates. Many aliens were hearing these details for the first time. In every case, the problems disappeared immediately after integration was completed, almost like they were never really problems at all, just motivational tools. Chancellor Luxor Prime's form was now pulsing with what Elena recognized as barely controlled fury. These are serious accusations, Ambassador. The Empire has always acted in the best interests of developing species. I'm not making accusations, Chancellor, Elena replied calmly. I'm simply sharing information that we gathered during our own intelligence operations. You see, while you were conducting your standard preliminary assessment of human space, we were conducting our own assessment of the Empire. She stood up and walked closer to the center of the chamber, making sure her voice would carry clearly. We've been monitoring your communications since the moment your first ship entered our system. We know about your fleet deployments, your resource extraction operations, your subject species management protocols. We know exactly how Imperial integration really works. The chamber had gone completely silent again. Elena could feel the weight of their attention, but also something new. Fear. For the first time in 12,000 years, the Empire was facing a species that had been watching them just as carefully as they had been watched. We know that integration is just a polite word for conquest and exploitation. We know that your member species aren't partners. They're subjects whose resources, labor, and military forces are managed by Imperial administrators. We know that resistance has always been impossible, because no species has ever been prepared for your methods. Elena paused, letting this information sink in, until now. She activated her final display, and the images that appeared sent the chamber into complete chaos. They showed detailed intelligence on Imperial military positions, supply lines, communication networks, and strategic vulnerabilities. The data was comprehensive enough to plan effective resistance operations throughout Imperial space. We've also been in contact with resistance movements among your subject species. It turns out there are quite a few groups who would be very interested in learning about military tactics, advanced weapons technology, and coordination strategies. The implications of this statement were staggering. The Empire had never faced coordinated resistance from multiple species simultaneously. Elena looked directly at Chancellor Luxor Prime. So you see, Chancellor, we've spent the past 3 weeks doing exactly what you did to us. We studied your weaknesses, mapped your critical systems, and established contact with potential allies. The only difference is that we're being honest about it. Her voice carried clearly through the stunned silence. The question before us today isn't whether humanity will submit to Imperial conquest. The question is whether the Empire is prepared for the first real war it's faced in 12,000 years. The chamber erupted into complete chaos. Aliens were shouting, flashing colors, and making sounds that Elena's translator couldn't even identify. The Carvex commander was on his feet, all 6 arms gesticulating wildly. The Nebulans had formed defensive formations, and the Zephyrians were strobing through colors so rapidly it was making some of the other species dizzy. Chancellor Luxor, Prime's form blazed with energy patterns that Elena was pretty sure meant he was absolutely furious. When his voice finally cut through the noise, it carried a tone she hadn't heard before. Raw, undiluted authority backed by 12,000 years of absolute power. "Enough," he roared. "This council will come to order now." The chamber slowly quieted, but the tension was so thick Elena could practically taste it. Every alien in the room was staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to outrage to what might have been fear. Elena remained standing in the center of the chamber, her hands clasped behind her back in a relaxed military posture. She had expected this reaction. Everything was going exactly according to the plan Earth's leaders had developed. "Ambassador Vasquez," the Chancellor said, his voice now deadly calm, "you have made some very serious statements here today. Accusations about Imperial methods. Claims about resistance movements. Threats of military action. Do you understand the gravity of what you are suggesting?" Elena nodded respectfully. "I understand completely, Chancellor, and I want to be very clear that these are not accusations or threats. They are simple statements of fact and expressions of humanity's position." She activated her holographic display one more time. The image that appeared was a formal document with official seals and signatures. "This is a formal diplomatic communication from the United Earth Government to the Galactic Empire. I am authorized to present humanity's official response to your integration offer." The document expanded, so everyone in the chamber could read it. The language was clear and unambiguous. The Empire will immediately withdraw all military and surveillance assets from human space. You will formally apologize for conducting unauthorized reconnaissance operations against our sovereign territory. You will open negotiations for the peaceful liberation of the 847 species currently under your control. The silence that followed was absolute. In 12,000 years, no species had ever made demands of the Empire. The very concept seemed to break something fundamental in how these aliens understood the universe. Elena continued reading from the document. "In return, humanity offers the Empire something you haven't experienced in 12 millennia, a genuine choice." She looked up from the document and made eye contact with as many aliens as possible. "Reform your methods. Release your subjects. End the practice of forced integration through coercion and manufactured crises. If you do this, Humanity will consider establishing peaceful diplomatic relations with a reformed empire. The Carvex commander found his voice first. And if the empire refuses these demands, Elena's expression became very serious. Then you will discover something important about humanity, Commander. You will learn the difference between species who submit because they want to demonstrate their intelligence, and species who fight because they want to demonstrate their principles. She walked closer to the military commander, looking up at his towering insectoid form without any sign of intimidation. Humanity has spent our entire evolutionary history at war. We've fought our environment, our predators, our diseases, and each other. We've survived ice ages, asteroid impacts, global disasters, and everything else the universe could throw at us. We've rebuilt our civilization from ashes multiple times rather than accept defeat. Elena's voice grew stronger as she spoke. We've never been successfully conquered by any force in our history because we have one characteristic that apparently makes us unique in this galaxy. We would rather die free than live as subjects, and she turned back toward Chancellor Luxor Prime. You've been very successful using fear as a motivational tool, Chancellor, but fear only works on species that value survival more than freedom. Humanity is not one of those species. The Chancellor's form pulsed with patterns Elena couldn't interpret. You cannot be serious. Humanity is one small species with primitive technology. The Empire controls thousands of star systems and hundreds of advanced civilizations. Elena smiled, and there was something in that expression that made several aliens step back slightly. You're absolutely right, Chancellor. Humanity is small and our technology is primitive compared to yours, but you're making the same mistake that every enemy we've ever faced has made. You're assuming that superior numbers and technology guarantee victory. She activated her display again, showing images from human history, battles where smaller forces had defeated larger ones through superior tactics, determination, and willingness to accept casualties. What you don't understand is that we've been preparing for this war our entire history. Every conflict we've ever fought has taught us something about defeating larger, more powerful opponents. Every defeat has taught us how to rebuild and come back stronger. Elena's voice carried clearly through the silent chamber. You've been conquering species that were afraid of war, species that valued peace and prosperity more than independence, species that were willing to trade freedom for security. She paused, letting the implications sink in. But now you're facing a species that was forged by war, a species that sees your overwhelming power not as a reason to surrender, but as a challenge to overcome, a species that has always fought best when the odds were against us. The Carvex commander leaned forward, his compound eyes focusing on Elena with predatory intensity. Brave words, human. But wars are won by more than just brave words, Elena nodded. You're absolutely right, Commander. Wars are won by preparation, intelligence, strategy, and allies, all things that humanity has been working on for the past 3 weeks. Her final display showed the true scope of what Earth had accomplished during the consideration period. Alliance agreements with resistance groups throughout Imperial space, weapons technology sharing arrangements, coordinated strike plans targeting Imperial supply lines and communication networks. While you were waiting for our surrender, we were building a coalition. While you were assuming our submission, we were planning your defeat. While you were following your standard 12,000-year-old routine, we were preparing to show you something new. Elena gathered her documents and prepared to leave. You have 7 standard galactic days to begin your withdrawal from human space. During that time, you can choose whether you want to reform the Empire peacefully or discover what happens when humanity goes to war. She walked toward the chamber exit, her footsteps echoing in the absolute silence. At the doorway, she turned back one final time. Oh, and Chancellor, the next time you want to visit someone's home, I suggest you try knocking first. Elena walked through the massive doors, leaving behind a chamber full of aliens who were struggling to process something they had never experienced before. The possibility that their empire might not be invincible after all. Behind her, the most powerful beings in the galaxy began to realize that their 12,000 years of easy conquest were about to come to an end. Humanity had declared war on the Empire, and for the first time in galactic history, no one was sure who would win. The age of easy imperial expansion was over. The age of human resistance had begun.